coming to you from somewhere between Hollywood and West Hollywood. I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. Today it's a special episode because we have a visit, or rather we have a few visitors from South Korea. We have a trip here from the Literary Translation Institute of Korea, where they brought a couple of authors whose names you're really going to want to know if you're interested in not just Asian literature, not just Korean literature, but modern literature. We're going to be talking to them, but first we have an extra special segment to come before our special episode, a conversation with the director of the Literary Translation Institute of Korea, Kim Seong-kon. Tell me, how do you see, not just the official line, but how do you see the mission of this organization?
We translate Korean literary works into 30 different languages and publish them overseas in order to raise the profile of Korean literature in the international community. And besides that, we do a lot of other things, like when a book of translation of a Korean literature comes out, we bring the Korean writer to the foreign country for a promotion event.
And that's what's going on today, right?
Just like today, we brought two eminent, distinguished Korean writers.
Indeed. So tell the listeners, who are these eminent writers sitting right to our side?
Next to me is Suah, and then Cheon Myeong-kwan. Everybody knows them in Korea. They are very popular in Korea.
Why are they so popular in Korea? What do you think is the reason Korean readers have so enjoyed their books?
As for Suah, she brilliantly, beautifully portrays the agonies of the younger generation. The Korean younger generation have gone through difficult times from military dictatorship, and then before that, of course, the Japanese occupation. And then the devastating Korean War, and then military dictatorship, and the age of industrialization. And today they live in the age of electronics and IT technology. But they have their own agonies in a seemingly affluent society of South Korea. Like they face frustrations, loneliness, and then alienation, and then disintegrated families because of rapid industrialization and so forth. And she beautifully captures that atmosphere and landscape, even though it's bleak sometimes. And then it was persuasive to the Korean reader. Also, I guess it will be persuasive to the international readers, including American readers. And as for Cheon Myeong-kwan, she's frequently compared to Gabriel Marquez and his novels, such as My Cousin Bruce Lee and Where, are compared to 100 Years of Solitude, because novelist Cheon portrays recent Korean history with magic realism. You can see by reading his books how the Korean people have gone through difficult times in each period. Far behind, there's a sort of a political repression in the past, and then industrialization, and everything is changing. And in that particular environment, of course, you pursue money and the machine, but sometimes in the meantime, you lose many things, such as pastoral dreams, and then humanity, and so forth, and then the value of a family, and so forth.
And why is Los Angeles an important place to bring these writers? I mean, of course, there's cities all over the world people are reading in. Why does the organization want to be here as well?
LA is a special city. We all know that LA has a large, big, huge Korean-American community. And LA is a global city, multicultural, multi-ethnic city. So we thought that probably the Korean sentiment manifest in the works of Korean writers are appealing to the people who live in LA.
Right. It's certainly appealing to me, and I live here. So I agree with you. Perfectly correct. And one last thing I want to know from you is, tell me something we English language readers don't know about Korean literature. What do you really want? What do you want to bring to the wider world from Korean literature that somebody, a lot of people listening don't read Korean? What are they missing out on that soon you hope you'll be able to give them through the Translation Institute?
Something which is uniquely Korean, I should say, the Korean sentiment, the Korean psyche, the Korean mind. For example, when it comes to Korean family, mothers are extremely important. In Cheon Myeong-kwan's novel, Modern Family, it portrays a family, of course, is disintegrating, but the children are coming back to their home after they fail in society, after they are aged. Still there's a mom, the presence of mom waiting for them. In Korea, in Korean culture, mothers are extremely important. There's a strong bonding between you and your mother, and mothers are a symbol of something to which, the point of reference to which you're constantly returning to. It was like, mothers like home to a certain extent. In Korea, the image of mother is like the image of a mother bird. Mother bird does not eat anything all day. She's just busy feeding her children. It was just like that. Probably maybe different from American culture. To me, it's like in the United States, mother is someone, of course, you dearly love, but someday when you grow up, you have to leave her. You have to be independent of your mother in order to become an adult. But in Korean culture is sort of the other way around. So that sort of difference does exist between American culture and Korean culture. And by reading the novels of Korean writers, American readers probably perceive the difference and other aspects of human civilization and human culture. There are many other things, of course, but the differences, cultural differences, are important. And it is important to learn about cultural differences, learn about other people and other culture.
And now we'll get these authors' take on all of this. Director Kim, 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. Thank you.
As Director Kim said, we are here with two authors well known in Korea and who will soon be well known, I hope, here in Los Angeles and the rest of America, Suah and Myeong-kwan. They are the authors of, in English, the new books, though they're books written before, but new to us, Nowhere to be Found and Modern Family, both of which I've read and enjoyed, and they make me want to read more from these two authors. We're going to have an interpreter here, so you'll be hearing the voices of the authors, but above that, the voice of the interpreter, just NPR style. So go with it. You'll see what I mean, listeners. First, I think in America, we think of Koreans as being very family-oriented, very strong families, very education-oriented, very achievement-oriented. The families in these novels are very different. The characters in these novels, both of them, are not very motivated. You could call them failures. And their families are not supportive. The families are even worse than the characters themselves. They're in a worse position than the characters themselves. And so I'll begin asking Suah, what is the family situation of this nameless narrator of Nowhere to be Found? How does it compare to this image we have of Korea as high-achieving, strong family people?
저는 이 철수를 쓸 때 가족.
When I first thought about writing this, when I first wrote this novel, I thought that these people were in different situations. These people were in poverty. In contrast to Korea's motivated and success-minded people. The protagonists in Nowhere to be Found, these people used to be middle-class citizens before, but their family deteriorated and now are in deep poverty. This could be perceived as an image of the Korean society, but I don't exactly agree that this is a typical image of that, because society and human beings are two-sided. They could have positive aspects as well as dark aspects, and I think those two aspects coexist in a society.
Myeong-kwan, in Modern Family, I mean the title says a lot of it right there, but in Modern Family you present first this family situation that has long since fallen apart. What has happened to this family?
아까 앞에 얘기하신 미국에서 인식하는 한국의
As you said before, Korean families are stereotypically perceived as goal-oriented and wanting success and having strong family ties, but because of that image. So in Korea, there is a traditional phrase called 입신양명, which is that you have to glorify your family name. And to do that, Koreans sometimes sacrifice themselves and work very hard to achieve their goals. But the people in this novel, Modern Family, are the people who fail to do that. In some cases, they are bankrupt and they committed crimes, and some are divorced, and they are failures in that aspect.
열심히 일을 하기도 하는데 이 소설은 오히려 그래서 그런 거에서 실패한 사람들 얘기거든요. 그러니까 뭐 파산을 하거나 또는 범죄자가 되거나 또는 뭐 이혼을 해서 가정이 깨지거나 한 사람들의 얘기죠.
Both novels are not necessarily about families, they're about protagonists in these type of families. And Suah, in Nowhere to Be Found, you have, as I say, a nameless narrator who is... I still am thinking about what her condition is, what it is she must be suffering from. But the name of the novel in Korean, Cholsu, this is how I read it anyway. I'm not that good at Korean, so maybe I'm wrong, but it has a double meaning. It's the name of the character's not quite boyfriend, sort of male figure, the man in her life, sort of. But it's also a word meaning withdrawal or to pull back from something. Is that a description of her condition, withdrawal?
네, 그렇게 책을 읽을 수 있는데 굉장히 흥미로운 해석이라고 생각해요.
That's a really interesting interpretation of this book. That 철수, withdrawal, it can have a meaning of withdrawal, it can have a military connotation. And this word can mean her special psychological state. But 철수 has another meaning. It's a very common name in Korea, like Hans in Germany and perhaps Jimmy in the United States. And Koreans have a very specific image when they think of that name. So traditionally, 철수 is a name that comes up in elementary school textbooks. It's a typical name of Korean boys, so that's what people think of when they first read this book. But Americans are not familiar with the name 철수, so the translator suggested that we should change the title of the book from 철수 to Nowhere to Be Found.
And this protagonist, this nameless narrator, is a woman in her mid-20s, in this poor family. She's supporting the family. And she, through it all, seems to be desensitized. Is this desensitization something that you had seen reflected in other Korean literature? Or is it a feeling you hadn't read in other books and you wanted to write about as a result?
그 대답을 하기 위해서는 제가 한국 문학을 많이 읽었어야 하는데
To respond to that question, I would have to be a prolific reader, which I am not very sure I am. But I believe every writer has a sense of desensitization from the society, to distance oneself from the society, and I think that is very natural for writers.
And Myeong-kwan, the protagonist of Modern Family, is different. He's in his 40s. He's 48, I believe. It's not that he is unambitious, but he had ambitions, and those were frustrated. He is also desensitized in a way, I would say. Not the same way, but would you say this combination of his failed film career and his enormous alcoholism have desensitized him?
그렇죠. 어떻게 보면 제 주변에서 매우 흔한 유형의 인물이거든요.
In some ways, the type of person in Modern Family is a very common one. I worked in the movie industry for about 10 years, and I've seen a lot of friends who had suffered this kind of failure. And rather than looking at the lives of the successful
오히려
people,
이건 그 이면의 이야기.
looking
성공한
at
사람이
the
있으면
other
실패한
side of the
사람도 있고,
coin, looking at the failed
작가들은
people
당연히
is what writers naturally try to do.
실패한 사람들에게 시선이 갈 수밖에 없는 거죠.
Now, we've hardly mentioned this, but in Modern Family, this protagonist goes back to live with his broken family, and in that way, the broken family comes back together. It's a funny situation. There's many opportunities for comedy, and I think every foreign reader will laugh a lot reading this book, not just about the older brother's farts, but about the very nature of the situation of middle-aged siblings all living with their mother again. But did you consider that to be an inherently funny situation? By its very nature, this would be comedic, putting together middle-aged siblings, putting them under their mom's roof, which would be an absurd thing in American literature.
그런 면이 있죠. 예, 그러니까 그 코미디적인 상황을 제가 원래 그런 걸 좋아하고.
In a sense, yes. I personally like comedy, and I wanted to describe how characters would behave in such absurd circumstances, how comedic the situation would be. It's a very dire situation for each of the characters, but I thought that in such situation, comedy is necessary.
It's true. I feel like when Americans or any foreigners get interested in Korean storytelling, it's because there is every mood at once, in a way, dark and light, grim and hilarious at once. And in Modern Family, there's so much that's funny, but then there's so much that's very grim. There's savage beatings, there's sort of gangland deals, there's just a lot of despair all at once. Do you consider that an expectation in Korean literature or filmmaking, that there is such a darkness and such a lightheartedness at once?
그렇죠. 영화하고 문학은 좀 다른데.
Well, Korean literature might be a little different because Korean literature tend to be very far away from the light side because a lot of them are about private feelings and thoughts. On the other hand, Korean movies have a much more light connotation, and I think my novel is a combination of both characteristics from Korean literature and Korean movies.
And Suah, nowhere to be found, I don't think anybody will consider it a comedy, but there are situations that are surprising, and I don't know how to put it, but the way one situation, one scene connects to another is surprising. And surprise, I think, is an essential element of humor, but is anything in this novel, when you read this novel, because you wrote it in the 1990s, looking back, is there anything funny in it, to your mind?
저도 그런 점에서 천명관 씨랑 이렇게 생각이 비슷한 게
On that point, I agree with Mr. Cheon because I think humor is essential when writing a story, and I think it's an essential element, and I try to put it in whenever I write a novel. But I have been often disappointed because a lot of the readers don't perceive my novels as humorous, and I sometimes think that maybe I'm not that a good writer of humor. I try to include the small humorous details in Nowhere to be Found, but a lot of the small group of Korean readers who have read my novel find it very dense and profound, and well, in the case of humor, I try to combine it with the grotesque scenes and the humorous scenes.
And there's one particularly grotesque element I think American readers, English language readers, will laugh at, just maybe out of shock, which is the incompetence of your narrator's mother, her incompetence at being a provider is a lot of the reason your narrator has such a difficult life. Talking with director Kim earlier, we talked about the importance of the mother in Korean literature, and here is a mother who is only a problem. She only causes problems. So I wonder, in your opinion, or do you think about how foreign readers will perceive this mother, given that they don't have they don't know what a Korean mother should be, so they don't necessarily know really how bad this mother is.
물론 그녀는 긍정적인 이미지는 분명히 아닙니다만.
Well, her situation, she has been able to be a housekeeper for her lifetime, and she also attended a beauty pageant when she was young. She's a typical character from her age. So I tried to portray her not as a mother, but a woman in her era. And there was a bit of satire in it, and not a critique, but a satire. She was a woman of her era, and that's why she is incompetent. As President Kim said, the Korean society has a strong sense of responsibility, a strong image of motherhood, of being a mother. But not everyone can exactly portray that image. So, and sometimes, in some cases, because they know about that image, they know about that responsibility, that could be burdensome to them.
Myeong-kwan, in Modern Family, as we say, these three middle-aged siblings move back in with their mother, but this mother is different than the mother in Nowhere to Be Found. She may be in her 70s. She may be seemingly past her prime of motherhood, yet she becomes, in a sense, this super mother for her children in their 40s and 50s. This is astonishing in especially America, when you're considered a failure if you live with your mother past the age of about 21. The mother would probably kick you out. Is it less surprising in the context of Korean literature with this idea about what a mother should be?
그렇죠. 여기 나와 있는 등장하는 어머니는 이제 한국에서 흔히 얘기하는 강하고
The mother in this novel does portray some sides of the typical Korean mother, strong, mother-like, and caring. But it's not only about the traditional image of motherhood, because she also can be ashamed of her own desires, and she also has her own desires too.
부끄러워하거나 희생만을 하지 않는 그런 엄마의 모습이죠.
The sense of a scenario that brings a family back together again. I mean, was that where this novel began for you?
그렇죠. 바로 그 나이든 형제들이
That is indeed right. The story of grown-up brothers and sisters coming back to live with their mother, and like when they were children, was an interesting situation for me, and it was a motivation for my writing.
And Suah, I want to ask you what it felt like to revisit this novel, knowing it would appear in translation. But first, I'll ask you something else. Was there, as with the Reunited Family or the family rebuilt again in Modern Family, was there an image or a concept you remember beginning this book with?
이 고령화 가족과는 좀 반대로
It's quite the opposite of Modern Family, because in this family, the protagonist, she knows that she's going to leave this family, and her brother too knows that he's going to leave his family, and he actually does. In the case of the youngest sister, who was 10 years younger, the protagonist looks at her with sympathy, because she is young and she is still under the responsibility of her mother, and she can't leave her family yet.
And when you did look back at this book, did it look the same to you as when you wrote it initially? Did it feel different for reasons of time or for reasons of knowing it would be in another language?
사실은 있었어요. 그게 이 번역이라는 장치를 통과하기 위해서는
I did feel that way. To go through translation, some of the ambiguous points in the novel had to be clarified. So while talking to my translator, we talked about how the protagonist has a tendency of showing SM, and she had some sadistic sides to her, and now I see it. I believe I wasn't able to really portray that point really well because I wasn't as mature as a writer then.
그런 경향을 좀 구체적으로 밝히지 못했던 것이 조금 안타깝긴 했어요.
And you say that your narrator wants to escape the family. Is there a sense in which she also wants to escape the effects the wider culture, the society has had on her?
Such interpretation depends on the reader.
If they think she does, she does?
그것은 저의
that's out of my bounds, I think. And I think it'll be better if the writer doesn't really restrict the opinions of the readers and leave it to the readers to think over the novel.
Myeong-kwan, in Modern Family, the character, the protagonist remembers when he was hanging out in school with friends who wanted to, in a way, escape society, escape their own culture by immersing themselves in Western culture, French film, for example. And indeed, in the book, Western culture, works of Western culture make many appearances. For example, as titles of the chapters, Jules and Jim, or works by Ernest Hemingway. And the character, of course, reads Ernest Hemingway in the novel. Is it an exaggeration to say that those efforts to move toward Western culture were a way to escape the effects of Korean society as best they could?
실제로 이제 저희 세대는
in reality, my generation, well, to exaggerate, is a generation that was mesmerized by Western culture. My generation was actually a generation that read Hemingway, watched movie directed by Truffaut, and listened to rock and roll. So the protagonist is kind of a typical image of that generation.
지금 나오는 그 주인공의 그런 세대적인 면이 반영이 된 거죠.
And Suah, what kind of cultural awareness would you say your protagonist has? She seems intent mostly on survival. Is that true?
예, 소설에 나와 있는 것으로 볼 때는 이 여주인공은 무슨
The protagonist was indeed affected by her generation, and she must have liked movies and music from Western culture. But the reason why that aspect wasn't included in her monologue is because that she didn't consider it as important in her life.
자기 인생에서 중요하게 영향을 미치는 요소로 생각하지 않았던 것이 아닐까.
As important as the basic necessities of protecting her sister, surviving, working, those sorts of things?
자기 자신
To her own problems mattered more rather than the problems out of her own world.
For the last segment, since this is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast, I would like to ask something relevant to this city where we are. And so, Myeong-kwan, we're here sitting in the city that is the center of the American film industry. And in Modern Family, your character has spent a lot of time wandering Jungmuro, the center of the Korean film industry. Do you feel that it's a similar world, the struggles people go through and the disappointments and various forms of alienation of the Korean film world in Jungmuro and the American film world, what you know of it in Los Angeles?
그래요. 저는 옛날에 로버트 알트만 영화의 플레이어라는 영화가 생각이 나는데
Your question reminds me of Robert Altman's movie Player, and when I watched that movie, I found that the American film industry is not that different from the Korean film industry. There are many characters in that movie, from producers to movie scenario writers, but in the essence, both industries had similar qualities. And while there is a strong spotlight, there are many dark places, so I think that could be very similar.
And speaking of dark places, Suah, this is a city you mentioned to me earlier that you visited twice. This is your second visit to Los Angeles. This is a city, Los Angeles is a city where there's a tradition of people feeling alienated or being lost, not knowing what to do, not knowing why they're here, and feeling like the city doesn't make sense on one level, yet on another level it does make sense. In other words, I feel like it's a city that fits your sensibility as a writer. what have been your impressions of Los Angeles on your last visit, or we're early in this visit, but is it a city you feel suits the way you think at all, if that makes sense?
저 LA는 저에게 좀 잊을 수 없는 그런 도시예요. 왜냐하면 지난번에 처음으로 이제 LA를 방문했을 때
LA is an unforgettable city to me. I remember in my first visit, I was reading and waiting for a friend at the airport, and one homeless person handed me $20. So I thought it was a very kind gesture, and rather than perceiving the dark sides of LA, I thought it was a very fun and friendly city. And this time,
저는 무척 유쾌하게, 물론 가난한 그 상황이었지만 즐겁게 여행을 마쳤고, 이번에 와서는 굉장히 멋진 호텔에서 묵어서 그 정도.
I remember that I saw the movie Sunset Boulevard, and I thought that the movie was very impressive, and I was surprised to find that Sunset Boulevard actually exists here. And it was quite different from the movie, but it still is very interesting.
정말로 선셋 블루바드가 있는 거예요. 그게 너무 놀라워서. 근데 사실 가 보고서는 조금 영화에서의 그런 분위기하고는 조금 달랐던 기억이 나요.
And on that sentiment, I will take the opportunity to welcome you again to Los Angeles for this trip, as you've just got here yesterday, I believe, and to thank you for taking the time. 작가님, 감사합니다.
고맙습니다.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. This special episode here featuring two writers, Suah and Myeong-kwan, brought to you by the Literature Translation Institute of Korea. And of course, thanks again to Director Kim, whom we heard from earlier in the episode, and to Cheon, who has been translating for us here. Thank you very much. 감사합니다. You can keep up with the LARB at lareviewofbooks.org or with me at colinmarshall.org. Thanks.